Greetings, fellow adventurers. This is Darkfire Slide, and welcome to a basics video for Pathfinder Kingmaker. Now, the game's only been out for about 3 days now, and I haven't really sunk my teeth too deeply into the game yet. I'm about getting close to 5th level with my characters. Completed the first act, more or less. But what I specifically wanted to do today was go over how to actually, basics for building characters in Pathfinder, to hopefully facilitate people actually being able to complete this game, because I know a lot of people are complaining about the difficulty, and to be honest, I think a lot of it has less to do with how difficult the game actually is and more with people not understanding how to build their characters. Pathfinder is not a game where you can build characters in a, shall we say, flippant way. So, the thing is, a lot of people like to throw out the term min-maxing, and what I'm about to describe is not min-maxing. What I'm about to describe is what I would call optimization. So the difference between min-maxing and optimization is that if you're min-maxing, you're specifically trying to break the game, but if you're optimizing your character, you're just trying to make them functional so that they perform at the level that they're actually at. And this is especially true for classes like fighters, who are a lot easier to mess up than a class like a wizard, for example. But I'll get more into those specifics later. What I'm specifically going to cover in this video is how to distribute your ability scores, what race to pick, and I'm going to go through a test build, or a very quick build that you can do yourself that's going to be pretty effective, with the 4 quote, core classes of Pathfinder, being Fighter, Rogue, Wizard, and Cleric. All of these are builds that you can do yourself, and we'll do them very, very quickly here, so that you can have a character that's good at the gate, and you don't have to worry too much about, like, oh, I'm just min-maxing or something like that. So anyway, let's go ahead and get into the character builder here. Doesn't matter what difficulty we're going to do. We're obviously going to create our own character. We'll just do default fighter man portrait. Okay, so it actually asks us to do our race first, which is interesting, because ideally you'd want to do your ability scores first, and then ideally pick your class. So I'm going to do it in that order, actually, rather than deal with anything else. And then it asks us to do our skills. This is a little bit messy. I'm not a big fan of this part of the character creator, actually. So let's start with ability points. So these are the things that honestly are going to be the make or break part of your build, and so I'm going to spend a minute talking about them here, just because I think it's very important to understand. So the developers of Kingmaker were kind enough to show you which stats are recommended for your build. Now, characters can get up to a maximum of an 18 with a given score by normal means. And that's going to cost you 17 points. So it's a lot to actually get up there. But this cost isn't actually as steep as it seems. And I'm going to show you real quick the way I would build a fighter, just to kind of give you an idea of the kind of build that you should be striving to achieve in this game. Right? Okay. So this is what I would consider a fighter who's actually pretty decent at what he does. He's a human fighter. He's got a spectacular strength score, a good dexterity score, and a good constitution score. We've dumped, and dumping means lowering to the maximum possible, his intelligence stat and his charisma stat. Why have we done this? That's so when we dump a stat, we get more points to put into another stat. Now, some people consider this to be very min-maxy, but the thing that I want to make a point here is that, let's say that we don't dump those stats. Let's see what our fighter looks like if we don't dump those stats. So first of all, we're going to have to get rid of that 18 at the very least, just to get our strength down to an acceptable level. And if we drop his constitution down to 15, so this is a similar build where his intelligence is reasonable now and his charisma is reasonable now. He's not a blubbering, incharismatic fool, shall we say. But here's the problem, right? So let's say that we wanted to make this guy a two-handed fighter. This is the thing you need to understand about Pathfinder ability scores. There are certain breakpoints that are very, very important when it comes to your character and their development. So, for example, we dropped his strength from 17 down or 18 down to 17. This is a problem for a number of reasons. The biggest reason that this is a problem. Now now of course this guy's a human. We haven't assigned his racial +2 to whatever we want him to have. But that being said, by having 17 strength, say we want to make him a two-handed fighter. So the way that two-handing works in Pathfinder is that if you two-hand a weapon, you add 1.5 times your strength modifier to the damage bonus with that weapon. So right now, if we're at a 16 or a 17 strength, which both have a +3 modifier for strength, he will do +3 damage with a one-handed weapon and +4 damage with a two-handed weapon. But if we boost his strength up to 18, and I'll go ahead and do that again, his modifier becomes a +4. So now he's doing +1 damage with one-handed weapons, which is good. +1 damage shouldn't be underestimated. But more importantly, if he's two-handing and he's got at least an 18 strength, that 50% bonus is going to give him a +6 to damage instead of a +4. So for two-handed characters, 18 is a massive breakpoint. A breakpoint the likes of which you don't see again until about 22 strength, I believe, when you get up to a +6 modifier. And if we boost his strength and we go ahead and get up to 20, it's a +7 instead of a +6, which again, every point of damage counts, but this is a less important breakpoint than 18 is. So anyway, I just wanted to demonstrate that one single concept before we went ahead here and talked about the rest of the stats. So strength is going to be your most important stat for all of your physical frontline fighters. This makes sense. It also improves your carry weight, and that's useful because in Pathfinder Kingmaker we use a shared party encumbrance system. So the more strength the character has, the more they actually contribute to your party's overall encumbrance. This reduces the amount of times that you actually have to spend resting. It allows you to travel longer without having to rest. And so it has like an actual campaign value in addition to being able to do more damage. I don't want to like understate this here, but for every class that does physical damage, so barbarians, paladins, fighters, if you want to do damage, you need to have a good strength stat. There isn't really much of a way around that. If you build a ranger with 12 strength and 18 dexterity or 20 dexterity, he's going to be accurate, sure, but he's not going to have a very good strength value because he doesn't have the class features necessary to actually make use of the fact that he hits more often. And the other thing that's nice about having just a very high strength for melee characters, and even ranged characters, is, but especially melee characters, is that your attack bonus goes up as well. So you're going to be hitting more, which is another problem that I see people complaining a lot about, is that they don't feel like they hit things very often. And if you have a higher strength, if you've optimized your build, and you have a 20 strength or an 18 strength to start with, then you're going to be in a much better position. Okay, next let's talk about dexterity. So we know that strength is good for physical fighters. Dexterity is good for ranged characters, and classes also like wizards and sorcerers who don't have armor to wear. Any class that doesn't wear armor or a lot of armor benefits from having at least a decent dexterity stat of about 14. You may not think that you need it, but it's actually very, very useful to have. And again, dexterity is not a stat that you want to dump a lot if you can possibly avoid it, because the problem is, if you dump your dex down to 8, for example, say you just want to build like this brute, this tank of a fighter, right? And we dump our stats and we end up with a stat spread like this. So this character's going to have a lot of health, but here's the problem. Even if he's wearing a full plate armor, right? He's actively taking a penalty to his defenses, and so even though he has more hit points, he's actually going to like be less durable than a character with more dexterity, because his armor class isn't actually the same as it would be as if he had a decent dexterity. So the problem with dumping dexterity is in essence that it's not just that you're at a -1, it's that the opportunity cost overall of having this low of a dexterity score is tremendous. So let's dump our constitution back down 2 points, get it from 18 to 16. We can get our dexterity all the way up to a 14. So in exchange for 1 hit point per level and a +1 to our fortitude save, which is what having that extra constitution would mean, we get a +3 to our armor class, we get a +3 to our overall compared to an 8, a +3 to our touch armor class, which makes us harder to hit by things like wizards, for example. And it's also going to give us a bonus to a lot of different skills. A lot of different skills use dexterity. A lot of useful skills use dexterity. Even for fighters, this is something to definitely you don't want to just like give up. The only like melee classes I would really recommend like dumping dex But not even dumping, keeping it at least like a 10 is Paladin, because Paladins are so spread thin on their ability scores that they don't really have a choice when it comes to Dexterity. But things like Fighters, things like Rangers, things like Barbarians, you want to have at least a decent Dexterity, because otherwise you're going to get hit a lot and you're going to die a lot, and that's not fun. It's just a classic character creation pitfall. Now, the thing is with a role-playing game like this, right, is say I really wanted to make the clumsy fighter. Well, you have the option of doing that, but you can't. What I disagree with is when people make builds like this, and then they complain that the game is hard. If you complain that the game is hard and you have a build like this, then you're doing it wrong. Like, the game is difficult. The game is built around you building a character that is actually reasonable and well made. Well, that's just kind of a side rant. So anyway, that's our Dexterity. So next we get on to Constitution. Constitution is a useful score. It's not a score that you should necessarily prioritize, and here's what I mean. There's an NPC in the game that you get very, very early on. Her name is Valerie. She has a stat spread that looks something like this. There's a boost right. I think I can actually build her stats straight up. This is more or less what she looks like. Her intelligence is an 8 instead of a 7, but otherwise this is completely identical to what her stats are like. So let me identify a couple of problems with this type of build, just as an example. So she is a frontline fighter who uses a tower shield, who has a little strength and a little dexterity, has a lot of constitution. So you would think that having a high constitution would be conducive to building the tank character who's really good at surviving a lot of hits. So here's the problem with that line of thinking. So by having this much constitution, a fighter starts with 10 hit points, and by having a constitution of 19, we get a +4 bonus, which means we get 4 extra hit points per level. So at 10th level, right, we're going to have an extra 40 hit points compared to someone who doesn't have this much constitution. But here's the thing, right? And I want to go back to demonstrating why having a high constitution is actually like more of a problem than it's worth. So this character has relatively a lot of health. If we look back at the other version of our fighter, where he only has 16 constitution, but he has 18 strength, dump that charisma back down. We only have 1 hit point less, but compared to having 14 strength, we're doing double the amount of damage modifier damage with a one-handed weapon. And if we're using a two-handed weapon, we're still doing double. We're doing +6 instead of +3 with a two-handed weapon. Plus, with higher strength, we affect our carry capacity more. We're able to hit more accurately and more often. The thing is, in Pathfinder, because you have limited character slots, you can't really play it like World of Warcraft, where you have characters who are dedicated to just eating damage and just sitting there and soaking up damage. The thing is that most people don't understand as well, is that you can make a character who's really bulky, you can make a fighter who specializes in heavy armor, but that doesn't mean that you have to sacrifice armor class or hit points in order to do it. At least not enough that you can't also be useful at killing things as well. So I think a pitfall that a lot of people make is that they put characters into these roles from like MMOs and such and other RPG games, where it's just not really true in Pathfinder. Characters in Pathfinder are extremely versatile. They have to cover a lot of different roles. Like, fighters aren't just like they don't just eat damage, they're also there to deal damage. Wizards aren't just there to deal damage, they're also there to debuff enemies. Clerics aren't just there to heal, they're also there to buff party members and kill undead. So every class in this game has a lot of different things that they can do, and if you box yourself in by thinking things like, I just need a lot of hit points because I'm a fighter, you're going to get yourself in a lot of trouble. So kind of the main theme that I want to get across here is that it's important to have a balanced character who is also really good at the one thing that their class is supposed to be good at. So for fighters, for example, that's usually going to be strength, unless you build a dexterity-based fighter, in which case you want mostly dexterity. Building a mostly constitution character is usually a bad idea. Building a mostly charisma-based character is usually a bad idea. Building a mostly wisdom-based character is usually a bad idea, unless the class specifically calls for that stat. Constitution, though, the only stat in the game that does not use constant, like, it's the only ability score that no class specifically uses, but it's an ability score that every class benefits from having a little bit of. On pretty much every class, if you want to build a character that's going to be able to survive for reasonable amounts of time, you want to have at least 14 Constitution, but for fighters and barbarians, having a 16 Constitution is also a reasonable amount of hit points to have. So, bearing that in mind, I just wanted to really get that off my chest because Constitution is useful, but don't trap yourself into making a character that actually sucks because you wanted more hit points. Anyway, I've forgotten to mention, Dexterity affects your reflex saves, so characters with high Dexterity are obviously going to have a much better chance of evading things like fireballs. Characters with high Constitution are really good at dealing with Fortitude saves, things like poison. And I'm gearing this guide towards people who haven't really played the game, aren't familiar with Pathfinder, and explaining it in a way that they can understand and build good characters. Okay, so next we have Intelligence. Intelligence is a dump stat, unless you're a wizard or even maybe a rogue, or if you're trying to get into like a duelist class, for example. There are some classes that benefit from having good intelligence, but for the most part, the only thing that intelligence really does is it gives you skill points. If you're not a wizard, wizards use intelligence to boost their spells. Other classes don't really. I think maybe the Magus uses intelligence as well. But if you're not one of those classes, you can actually feel pretty safe in dumping this stat. Let me explain how this works. So, I'm a human fighter. Humans get a +1 to skill points per level. Fighters get a base of 2 skill points every level. So, if you're... Let's say we're not a human, we don't get that bonus skill point. Say we're a dwarf. Dwarves don't get bonuses to their skill points every level. So, if I drop my intelligence down to 8, I'm only going to get 1 skill point per level, which sounds pretty crap, and it is pretty crap, and I'm not going to be any good at skills that require intelligence, which admittedly is a decent number of skills. Mostly the knowledges right here are completely intelligence-based, but the thing is, wisdom in general is better than intelligence. Why is this? Wisdom gives you a bonus to will saves. Intelligence doesn't give you a bonus to any saves. Intelligence gives you a bonus to skill checks. And the thing is, if you're a fighter, a will save is always going to be more useful than a skill check, pretty much bar none. Just because most of the skills in the game, somebody is going to be able to do that better than you. A wizard is going to be able to do a knowledge check better than you because they have high intelligence. A rogue is going to be able to do an athletics check better than you, and any of these skills better than you, even if you have a good dexterity as a fighter. Just because they're a rogue, they're going to have better dexterity, they're going to have more base skill points to work with. So the thing is, if your class doesn't get high skill points to begin with, don't worry about skills. This is not like a hard thing to understand. And the nice thing, one of the greatest things about Pathfinder Kingmaker is that characters in your party can actually use skill checks for you. So if you're talking to someone and there's a persuasion check, the game automatically picks the person in your party with the highest persuasion check. So people who are good at their jobs actually do their job in this game. You don't have to have every single skill with your character. If you want to build a beefy tank fighter but don't want to give up on conversation options, you don't have to in this game, because you have other characters that you meet along the way, or you can make your own that are good at those skill checks. So the thing is, if your class doesn't use intelligence, you don't need to have intelligence. Some people have like an ego issue with intelligence. They're like, I don't want my character to be dumb. Well, the thing is, like, 8 intelligence is just slightly below average, but it's not like you're completely like mentally gone, right? So that's why when we're building this character, we can safely dump intelligence and charisma in order to get stats that are actually going to help us with being a good fighter. I mean, look at this spread right here, right? So we've got a +3 to our armor class from dexterity, and this is very useful for fighters because of an ability they get called armor training, which I'll explain when I actually cover the fighter in a bit. And we have 16 constitution as well, so we're getting 3 extra hit points per level, 3 extra fortitude save bonuses. So this is a decently built character. Charisma, the only thing the charisma affects, right, for this fighter is going to be his persuasion checks and his use magic device checks. Persuasion is a class. I don't think persuasion is a class skill for fighter. It might be. Okay, it is. So persuasion is a class skill for fighter. So if you want to be like a persuasive fighter, there is, we could do this, right? we have 12 charisma, so instead of taking a -2, we're up to a +1, and so then when we do persuasion, we have a +5. It's not fantastic, but then we don't also have to give up our good physical stats in order to actually be there. So the thing is, this isn't min-maxing. This is optimizing. This is making a character that is actually good at what they're supposed to be trying to do, while also having some things on the side that that character might also be good at. But for example, we could also swap this charisma, because charisma doesn't affect anything except persuasion checks, and use magic device checks. And instead we can have 12 intelligence, and so then we get 4 skill points, and we can put, you know, points into all these skills here, and that suddenly we have a lot of skills. Or we can dump intelligence again, and this is if you don't care about your fighter skills, you can go ahead and put 12 into we can go ahead and get a 14 in Wisdom, have a 14 in Dexterity, and this is important. This may not seem good for a fighter, but we get a +2 to our will saves. That means your fighter is going to be less likely to run away from fear spells. He's going to be less likely to get mind controlled, just by virtue of not having intelligence and not having charisma. Again, this isn't min-maxing. This is just optimizing a character that's going to actually be useful and good at what they're supposed to do. But anyway, let's dial it back and let's talk about Wisdom. So Wisdom is actually a stat like Dexterity, like Constitution, that's pretty much always useful. You don't want to spam it unless you're a Cleric or a Monk. Apart from those two classes, Wisdom is just a nice thing to have, and it improves your perception checks, which is really nice for camping, helps you spot enemies early. It's also going to improve your will saves, which is, again, always useful. Always useful to have better saves. Dexterity always improves reflex saves, Constitution improves Fortitude saves, Wisdom improves will saves. It's always good to have better saves, because then you're more likely to avoid like nasty, debilitating debuffs. But apart from that, having a high Wisdom is something really only Clerics should do, because the difficulty of their spells to like resist is completely and wholly affected by their Wisdom score. So that's just something to bear in mind on that. Lastly, let's talk about Charisma. So the only things that Charisma affects are Persuasion, Use Magic Device, Bard abilities. Bards with higher Charisma do better things. The amount of times a Cleric can use his Channel Energy ability is affected by Charisma. Paladins need Charisma for a lot of their abilities. And Bards and Sorcerers use them to cast spells. But apart from those classes, they're pretty much very little to no reason to not just dump Charisma with every character. So here's the thing. Let's go back. Let's stop being Joe Fighter for a second, and let's go be Joe Rogue instead. All right, we're now Joe Rogue, and Joe Rogue's pretty cool. He's just a regular rogue. Let's go ahead and clear our stats here, and let me demonstrate how little of an impact Charisma actually has, even on a character. So we want to be a rogue. Let's say that we want to be a rogue with good charisma, or at least a decent enough charisma to actually be able to persuade people frequently. So let me just go ahead and build a rogue how I would reasonably build a rogue. Let's see. So we're immediately running into a problem here, right? You'll notice that I can't actually boost any of these other skills because we've put this awkward amount of charisma into our character build. But we can sneak off with something like, even then it's hard to really like sneak away with. So as we're running into all these even numbers, right? We're having a really hard time actually getting the scores that we want in the abilities that we want to be good at. So here's the thing about dumping charisma, right? So rogues get a lot of skill points. They get a base of 4 in this game, which is a lot in this game. And then they get bonus equal to their intelligence modifier, and then they get a +1 for being a human, if you're a human. So we get 7 points here, and there aren't actually that many skills in this game. 7 is huge. We can take pretty much everything, or next to everything, if we so desire, just based on our high intelligence score, and the fact that we're a rogue. So here's the problem with taking Charisma as a class that doesn't use it for essential class features. Because the only thing that a rogue would get out of Charisma is Persuasion and use Magic Device. So here's the thing. Let's say we dump our Charisma, right? We dump it down to 7. So instead of being at a +5, we go down to being at a +2. Well, that's less than ideal, right? But here's the thing. If I recall correctly, rogues themselves, and this is specific to rogues, of course, they get what are called rogue talents. And I believe that one rogue talent lets you actually improve a skill. It lets you take the skill focus feat, essentially, which I'll go ahead and showcase here. Actually, we need to finish building our character. Whatever. There's a feat called skill focus where you get a +3 to a certain skill, and it's checks. So the thing is, you could have a charisma of 12, and then you're stuck with this awkward array where you're not actually getting an optimized thing here. Like, we could have more strength to do more damage, wear better armor, like a chain shirt, for example, instead of just studded leather or leather. We can carry more, so our party's less encumbered. But instead we have this charisma stat, we have this wisdom stat. We're not particularly charismatic or particularly wise, we're just a little above average. We're above average intelligence and above average constitution, which again, we could dump down. Sure. Why not? But that still leaves us with an awkward stat spread. So the thing is, let's say that we wanted to be persuasive. We kept this 12 charisma. We used skill focus. We got a +8 to persuasion. Well, that's pretty good. The problem is that if you have a bard, or you have a sorcerer, or you have any charisma-based class, like a paladin, that gets persuasion, and they have to incorporate charisma into their build, they're going to be better than you are at that ability without taking a feat. So no matter what you do, you're still not really going to be that good at it. And even, let's say you wanted to go completely buck wild here, and you wanted to have a 14 in all of your all of your mental stats as a rogue, which I don't recommend this build, by the way. Even then, you get up to a +6. You can take skill focus and get a +9. But the thing is, you're wasting a valuable feat slot in order to actually do this. So charisma is perpetually the universal dump stat, because the only things that it lets you do, if your class doesn't use it, is persuasion and use a magic device, which again are two things that somebody that relies on charisma, like a bard, like a sorcerer, like a paladin, are going to be better than you at without taking a feat. They don't have to waste a feat slot while you do. So it's fun to do builds like this, but if you're trying to build an optimized character who's actually good at what they're trying to do, then you can safely feel free to dump charisma, because you don't use it for anything in this game. And let me show you by comparison what happens when we dump that charisma down to 7. So now we can bump our constitution up to 14. We have 11 hit points instead of 9. And we can also boost our strength up to a 12, which is pretty nice. And if we want to, we can raise our intelligence up to a 15, which is close to a 16, which would give us even more skills, and that would make us better at the skills that actually use it. Although with rogues, you pretty much always want to be looking out for dexterity. It still leaves us in a little bit of an awkward state with the rogue, because we can't really dump as much as the rogue, right? But we can remove our wisdom down to 12, which does hurt our will save and our perception check, and our 2 lore checks, but lore checks aren't an actual rogue skill. And perception is something that you can just you get it decently anyway, even without a crazy high wisdom. So this is what I would consider to be a more optimized rogue build, because you're sitting here at 18 dexterity, which is a good dexterity score. It's not a 20, but an 18 is still really good for dexterity. And this puts you in a good position to do all kinds of different rogue builds. You can do the Knife Master with ease with this build. You can use your feats and weapon talents to get Fencing Grace, I believe it's called, which lets you add... Actually, you don't even need to take a feat for it, because at 3rd level, you get a finesse training bonus, which lets you pick one weapon that you can use a weapon finesse, so like daggers, rapiers, etc., that lets you add your dexterity modifier to damage instead of strength. So really, we technically don't even need the strength bonus, and we can further optimize our character, right? We can have a little bit more constitution. Although with the strength, the thing is would be mostly the carry weight there, right? So anyway, I just want to reiterate one final point on ability scores. If you want to build a good character, you need to make sure they have good abilities in the stats that matter. Because if they don't, you're going to feel like your character sucks. It doesn't matter what you're trying to roleplay. Statistically, if your character is weak, you're going to feel weak and you're not going to have a good time with this game. Again, I'm not trying to min-max with the game here. This is just the way the game is meant to be played. It's okay for characters to have flaws. This isn't like Mass Effect, right? This isn't Dragon Age where your character is the beacon of everything that is awesome in the world. And I know I only mentioned BioWare RPGs, but it's okay for characters to have flaws because you're in a party. You have a party where people can cover each other's weaknesses. You don't have to worry so much about my character being able to do everything because, as I stated, characters can take over for you in conversations. You don't have to be the one doing the persuasion, but if you want to be, then there's ways to do that. And you do that by building your character well from the ground up with good ability scores. Right, so the next thing I haven't even talked about yet, and we'll just allocate some random skills here, because I want to get on to feats. There are feats that I consider to be generally good. And there are feat trees that I generally consider to be very good. And I want to talk briefly about feats that are basically always good to take for certain classes, no matter what. And it sucks that I can't really search them that well by name, and that some of them are gated off. But let's go ahead and start. So Toughness, and there are 3 other feats, are always good feats to take. So Toughness gives you +3 hit points, and then every additional level after that, or hit die rather, which is basically it's every level, you get an additional hit point. So at 10th level, you've gotten 10 more hit points than you have otherwise. Essentially what this is a bonus to your Constitution score without having to actually have a higher Constitution score. And Toughness is something that's useful for virtually every class, including wizards and spellcasters of all kinds, because those classes tend to actually be squishier than fighters. And so Toughness is actually basically more or less always a good feat to take. Even if your character is already bulky, you become even bulkier. Now that being said, it's always useful, but it's also not as useful as other feats that you could take. But if you're ever wondering like what feat should I take now, Toughness is always a good route to go, because hit points are always useful if you're getting hit, which happens a lot in this game. So the next 3 feats that I want to talk about are Great Fortitude, Lightning Reflexes, and Iron Will. So these 3 feats improve the save of the corresponding type. So Great Fortitude improves Fortitude saves, Lightning Reflexes improves Reflex saves, and Iron Will improves Will saves. One of the best ones out of these to take is usually Iron Will, because not a lot of characters have the points necessary to have will saves. So like fighters, for example, are a common choice on one of their levels where they don't have a bonus feat to take Iron Will, because they need the extra will save to be able to stay in the front line. And especially with Bravery on the default fighter, you can get up to a pretty decent will save even without a good wisdom score, although you should at least have a 12 or a 14 as a fighter. You can get up to a decent will save, and that way your fighter's not running away, getting slaughtered on the retreat, and leaving your spellcasters exposed. So Iron Will is actually probably the best of these 3. Great Fortitude is a really, really good one to take, and Lightning Reflexes is also a really good one. These are all good feats that apply to most characters, because all characters are going to run into a point where they're getting hit by a fireball. All characters are probably going to get poisoned at some point, and all characters are going to have to deal with fear saves at some point. So these 3 feats are always useful in most combat situations, because most combats have a save to make of some kind due to spellcaster or centipedes trying to poison you, or traps that try to entangle your legs. No matter what the situation is, better saving throws are almost always helpful, and these are extremely useful bonuses. Another really, really useful bonus to take, especially on, well, pretty much any class actually, whether it's rogues, fighters, wizards, whatever, except with the exception of maybe clerics, improved initiative is an ability that's going to let you go first more often. And it's incredible, even in a real-time game like Pathfinder Kingmaker, how much of a difference a feat like improved initiative can actually make. Because if you have a barbarian or a rogue that goes first, a rogue that goes first catches their opponent flat-footed because they haven't acted yet, and they get their sneak attack bonus. So you essentially get a free round of sneak attack because your character went first in the turn order. A barbarian can charge before they get to their enemies. A fighter with good initiative can get into position faster than the enemies can get to your spellcasters. Spellcasters with improved initiative can go first, cast debilitating buff spells before the enemy can get into formation. This feat is, again, almost always useful. There's rarely a situation where you don't want to have or improved initiative if you can afford it in your feat build, which you may not be able to after you've looked through feats where you've tried to decide like what can I have and what can I not. A feat that I really want to point out for ranged characters. Anyone playing a ranged character, ranged focus, whether it's a ranger or a rogue doing ranged sneak attacks, or a wizard who focuses on shooting rays even, anyone with a focus on ranged feats or ranged abilities is going to want to take this feat right here, Point Blank Shot, which gives an okay bonus of a +1 on attack and damage rolls with ranged weapons up to 30 feet. This counts for rays shot by wizards as well, so don't let the name fool you. It counts for ranged spells as well that are like that. Spells that actually require a touch, like a ray. But specifically, the reason that you need to take Point Blank Shot is so you can qualify for this feat right here, Precise Shot. So, Precise Shot is the most important feat in the game for a ranged character, and the reason for this is that normally when you are shooting at an enemy that is fighting one of your allies in melee, so your fighter and another fighter, like an enemy fighter, are fighting each other. If you shoot at the enemy fighter, you take a -4 to your hit, which is ridiculous. It's extremely bad. And so a lot of missing happens when you don't have this feat. So if you plan to do any kind of ranged work, you need to take this feat. I can't stress it enough. This is one of the most important feats in the game for ranged characters. You need to take it immediately if you plan on doing anything ranged whatsoever. Another feat that is very important, I don't think we qualify for it with this character, but I'll go ahead and scroll down to it. This is a selection of feats that essentially let you trade attack bonus for damage. This is very, very useful because a lot of enemies have things like damage reduction or just have a lot of hit points and low armor, and so the feats I'm talking about are Power Attack, Deadly Aim, and Piranha Strike. So, as you can see here, you can choose to take a -1 penalty on all melee attack rolls and combat maneuver checks to get a +2 to damage on melee rolls. Now, if you do this with a two-handed, the bonus is increased by 50%. So, at level 1, if you take Power Attack and you're using a two-handed weapon, you take a -1 penalty to your attack, but get a +3 guaranteed damage on your melee rolls. You can do extreme amounts of damage with this feat. I cannot stress how important this is for characters who are in melee and want to do a lot of damage. Even if you're only using a one-handed weapon, +2 damage is obscene. It's a lot of damage. It doesn't sound like a lot. It's a lot of damage. Because remember, this is damage that gets multiplied on a critical hit. So if you have a weapon with a ×3 crit modifier, a +2 becomes a +6. A +3 becomes a +9 if you manage to get critical hits with those weapons. You can instantly nuke a lot of enemies just by getting a crit with a power attack, which admittedly is less likely because you're taking an attack penalty, but the damage is so high that it's worth doing except against extremely armored enemies, for which there are other feats. But in general, Power Attack, Deadly Aim, which is Power Attack but with ranged weapons, and Piranha Strike, it's called. Let me go ahead and show where... I think we actually qualify for Piranha Strike. Yeah, we do, because we're a rogue right now. So again, Piranha Strike is the same thing. You just do it with weapons that use weapon finesse, like daggers and rapiers. These feats are just... they're essential to making most characters that do melee damage actually work. But I've talked enough about like physical characters, I think. Let's talk for a second about good feats for spellcasters. We're going to go ahead and look at, let's see, can I do Spell Focus? I can do Spell Focus as a, because you don't actually need to be able to cast spells, that's funny. So this is, say you are a blaster character who casts fireballs, say you are a illusionist who wants to confuse enemies, say you're an enchanter that wants to dominate enemies with like domination magic. You need to take Spell Focus of the school of that spell. So if you like to dominate people with enchantment spells, you need to take Spell Focus enchantment, because this adds a +1 to what's called the difficulty class of those spells. The difficulty class is how hard something is to save against when it comes to spells. So a fireball, for example, uses a reflex save, usually with a difficulty class of it's 10 plus the character's intelligence modifier plus the level of the spell. So usually anywhere between 17 and 18 or even 19 for characters with good intelligence. So this would make a fireball with a 19 reflex save. So you'd have to make a 19 on your reflex save to resist, up to a 20. And the thing is, there's a greater spell focus as well, which means that that 19 becomes a 21. So you are 10% more likely to actually affect your opponent. And I cannot state how huge this is, because everything in Pathfinder is relative, right? So that 10% is extremely hard to attain, right? We're talking about a difference between like a 50% chance of making a save versus like a 40% chance to make a save, which is more than 10%, right? Like that's actually a 20% higher chance of affecting an opponent than the raw percentage amount that this actually adds to the spell, if it's a 50% chance to begin with, of course. So spell focus is extremely important for any kind of offensive spellcaster that uses anything that involves difficulty class checks. Whether it's a sorcerer using evocation fireballs who just wants to blast things all day, you need spell focus evocation so that your fireballs do full damage most of the time. If you're an enchanter wizard who wants to dominate enemies, you need to have spell focus enchantment so that people can't resist those things. You need to have these things. These are very useful. Later on for spellcasters, the spell penetration feat is good, but you don't normally see enemies with spell resistance until at least about 8th or 10th level, so you can usually hold off on this feat until then, but when you do get to that point, you do want to have this. When you get to about 3rd level, or 5th level actually is when this really starts to come into effect, you'll want to look into getting meta magic feats. Pretty much all of these are useful, and what they let you do is they let you enhance the spell in some way by raising the actual level of the spell. So for example, the Empower spell adds 50% to the damage of a spell. So let's say you used your 5th level wizard and you want... let me back up. So Empower spell uses a spell slot that is 2 levels higher than the base spell. So a 1st level spell becomes a 3rd level spell with Empower spell. So for example, you could cast Magic Missile, but you could empower it, and admittedly this isn't going to do as much damage to a fireball, but it's guaranteed damage because it's a Magic Missile, right? You don't have to make any rolls or anything, you just do the damage. So normally a Magic Missile at that level would do 3d4 damage plus 3. 3d4 plus 3. Because each Magic Missile does 1d4 plus 1. So what this is instead going to do, so let's say you roll a 12 on that check, you would do 15 damage normally with that 1st level spell. With Empower spell, you would do 21 damage on a max roll instead, which is just a really, really, really high amount of damage compared to a 15. And this feat gets better the more time passes, right? So fireballs are good, empowered fireballs are fantastic, and eventually when you can qualify for it, Maximize spell lets you avoid RNG with spells by maximizing their numeric effects. So, but it increases the spell slot by 3 to actually use it. So, for example, say you were a 7th level wizard and you wanted to use Maximize spell, you could use it on a spell like Burning Hands. And so instead of rolling 5 4-sided dice, you would just do 20 damage with Burning Hands, guaranteed in a cone. Which is really nice. Heightened spell is really good for people who like to dominate things, because it lets you raise the effective level of a spell by improving the difficulty class. So let's say, for example, you really want to cast a Charm Person spell on somebody, but it's a 1st level spell, but you're a 7th level caster and you can cast 4th level spells. So what you can effectively do is cast Charm Person, get the same effect because it's still really darn useful to dominate people. Some spells are like that. They're useful regardless of level. But you can raise that to a 4th level Charm Person, which increases the difficulty class by 3. Which is massive. That is so much harder to resist, it's not even funny. And that combined with your spell focus is going to make it absolutely disgusting. Another feat that's always useful for casters is combat casting, because this is going to make it a lot easier to cast spells without incurring an attack of opportunity from your enemies. Always, always, always very useful. I'm trying to think of any other feats real quick. I don't think there are. Rapid Shot is always a very good feat for ranged characters. Once you get Precise Shot, that one is always worth taking. But apart from that, those are pretty much all the feats that are always useful pretty much all the time. So those are the feats that I would recommend to people who want to know what feats to take to start off with, or just want good feats in general to want to take. And a general tip is when you start building a character, you really should like check these available feats to see what kind of things are actually available, and try to build towards the better feats. Because the thing about Pathfinder is most feats lead to better feats. Most feats lead to better feats. I say most because obviously not all do, but some feats allow you to take feats that are exponentially better than the feat that gates into it. For example, Point Blank Shot into Precise Shot. Removing a -4 penalty is massive. Getting a +1 to attack and damage is so-so. It's good, but it's so-so because it's situational. But anyway, I think I've sufficiently covered. God, how long is this video already? Oh, it's already 45 minutes. I mean, that went about as planned, but anyway, let's go ahead and start building each of these characters, right? I didn't even talk about race. I completely skipped over race. Let me talk about race for a second. This video is going to be very long. Humans are good at everything. They get a +1. They get a +2 to any ability score that they want, so they can be better at whatever they want to be better at. Yeah, and that's just really good. They get a bonus feat. So the feats we just talked about, they get a bonus one at first level, and every level they get a bonus skill point. There is nothing a human cannot do. Humans are good at everything. If you don't know what race to pick and you're scared about like stat choices, just play a human. Humans are a go-to race. They're good at everything. You should just, like, if you don't know what to pick, just pick a human. You'll get a lot of bonuses from these abilities that will last you throughout the entire game. Alright, so let's talk about elves. Elves are good. Elves have a weakness, and that's that elves take a -2 to their constitution score. This is a problem because it means that elves are always going to be more frail than a race of the same type of class. And that can be a problem for certain classes. Moreover, they're stuck with wizard as their favorite class, if I'm not mistaken. Although I don't know if this game does favorite classes. Anyway, I digress. Elves get a lot of nice bonuses, but they don't get a bonus feat like humans do. So the thing to look out for when building an elf is typically you want to make the best use of their bonuses to Dexterity and Intelligence while not worrying so much about their Constitution penalty, although you do need to account for it pretty much regardless of what you play. So for example, elves make really good wizards. Why? Dexterity gives a bonus to their armor class because they don't wear armor. They never have to worry about armor weighing them down. And more importantly, Intelligence improves their spell casting. So you really want to like be a intelligence-based character as an elf. Elves also make fantastic rogues because they get a bonus to the 2 main stats that a rogue gets. And specifically, one really cool combination for rogues in this game, because of the way sneak attacking works, is you can actually elves get free proficiency with longbows, longswords, rapiers, and short bows. So normally classes that couldn't use those can use those weapons. So wizard normally can't use a longbow, but an elven wizard can. So an elven wizard isn't necessarily stuck with a bad weapon. And more importantly, an elven rogue can use a longbow, something that rogues normally can't, which is just that little bit better to make them more suited to that ranged, sneak attacking, assassin style of gameplay. So elves are really good for those 2 classes. Elves also make good intelligence-based maguses because of their good dexterity and intelligence, but again, they're going to be frail in combat due solely to the fact that they lose out on Constitution. So toughness for elves is almost always a necessity, and the problem with that is that you end up burning a feat overcoming a serious negative that your class or your race gives you. So elves are good at what they do, but you need to be mindful of what you do when you pick an elf, because you may end up with a character that just ends up being extremely frail to no real benefit. Let's talk about dwarves. Dwarves are hidden OP. I'm not joking. Dwarves are actually really good in Pathfinder. Dwarves get a bonus to their Constitution and Wisdom scores and a -2 to their Charisma. Now, we've already talked about how Charisma is a dump stat and nobody cares about it. And dwarves have even less charisma, but again, if you're playing a class that doesn't use charisma, it doesn't matter how negative your charisma is, because you can have your party members make the checks for you. And dwarves get a number of abilities that are extremely useful, that make them especially suited towards being clerics that wear heavy armor, or characters that wear heavy armor in general. They get an ability that lets them not worry about encumbrance. So no matter how encumbered a dwarf is, he always moves at the same speed unless he's extremely encumbered. They also aren't slowed down by heavy armor like normal characters are. Unfortunately, they stay at 20 feet movement, so they're naturally slow, but they're not any slower than a human fighter wearing the same equipment, for example. They get a +4 to resisting bull rushes or trip attempts. They get a +2 on saves against poisons, spells, and spell-like abilities. This is ridiculously good. I cannot stress, this is useful on every character ever. It does not matter what type of character you're playing as a dwarf. If you're a dwarven wizard, if you're a dwarven bard, which I don't recommend because of the charisma penalty, if you're a dwarven paladin, a fighter, barbarian, it doesn't matter. +2 bonuses on saves against poison and spells is absurdly good, and this is one of the reasons that dwarvens are hidden OP, because this bonus is just huge. This is ridiculously good. That combined with their constitution means that dwarves are extremely hard to poison or debuff in general, and especially because the wisdom score as well is giving them a bonus to will saves naturally. Dwarves are awesome. If you're wanting to play a melee character, I strongly recommend you play a dwarf, unless you want to be a paladin, in which case you should probably be a human or an Azemar. They also get a handful of other abilities that aren't as useful, but one thing that's really, really cool about dwarves is that they get free proficiency regardless of class, with battle axes, heavy picks, and warhammer, and any weapon with the name dwarven in its name is treated as a martial instead of an exotic weapon. So a dwarf can use a dwarven war axe, which is essentially an axe version of a bastard sword, for free as a fighter class, which is a d10 hit die of damage instead of a d8 die. And so that's going to be a little bit of extra damage for fighter type characters who are using one-handed sword and shield strategies. They get free proficiency with that. But even a dwarven cleric can still use battle axes, heavy picks, and warhammers. Warhammers are really good weapons. Battle axes are decent weapons. So you can still use these martial weapons as a wizard, as a cleric, as a rogue, as anything that doesn't get these proficiencies normally. Dwarves get very, very good bonuses. Dwarves also get a +2 to perception, which can be useful. Not as useful as in the actual tabletop game, but still useful. Bonuses to +4 AC against giants is nice, because giants have high hit chance, and they also get a +1 on attack and damage, or just attack rolls against orcs and goblinoids, because they hate these things. And trust me, there are orcs and goblinoids in this game, so those bonuses do come up. All right, let's talk about the gnome. The gnome is okay. The gnome gets a bonus to charisma, and the gnome gets a bonus to constitution. Takes a penalty to strength. Gnomes are great sorcerers and bards. They are not great paladins. They're okay paladins because of the charisma bonus. So they're just very tanky paladins, which doesn't really make sense. Apart from that, they don't really do all that much. But again, the constitution bonus is actually extremely useful for spellcasters of any kind, including wizards, just because that's bonus hit points, and you can never go wrong with bonus hit points. And because gnomes are small, they are harder to hit by a factor of 1, so they essentially get a +1 to their AC for free, in addition to having higher hit points. So that's useful on pretty much every class, but they do less damage with weapons by one die. So a D8 weapon normally would do a D6 with a gnome, and this is all true for halflings as well. One of the best builds for a gnome has to do with innate ability they get. Any illusion spell they cast has a +1 to the DC, and some illusion spells are ridiculous. There's an illusion spell that flat out kills someone. They have to make a will save against it, and you can buff up your intelligence to like an 18. You can have spell focus enchantment, or illusion rather, and just go crazy with illusion magic as a gnome. It's just really, really, really good. They get a bonus on knowledge world checks, which is okay. They're stuck moving slow because they're small, which isn't that bad. They resist illusions, which is okay. Defensive training against giants, +4 AC against something is useful, even if situationally. And they get a +2 on perception checks. They're an alright race. Good for casters, especially, because casters don't have to worry about fireballs having weapon damage problems. But let's move on to Halfling. Halflings are great rogues. Halflings get a +2 to Dexterity and +2 to Charisma. They also make good casters because of this bonus to Dexterity and Charisma. Don't recommend a Paladin with Halfling, just even with the Charisma bonus. But Sorcerer and Bard are both awesome options, and you actually get a Halfling Bard at the start of the game, which is a good pick because of the bonus to Charisma and Dexterity, both of which are good picks for that class. So anyway, Halflings are alright. We go through their bonuses real quick. They also take a -2 strength like gnomes do, but halflings get a +2 racial bonus on all saving throws against fear. This is okay. 20-foot movement speed, +2 bonus on athletics and mobility checks, which is fine. But it makes them better at tumbling, which is something that rogues get, and rogue is kind of the go-to class for halflings for sure. Very sneaky, very stabby characters for sure. +2 on perception checks is alright. They also get a +1 racial bonus on all saving throws, and again, this is something that's useful regardless of what class you are, but specifically for like squishy spellcasters that can be pretty useful. Let's move on to half-elf. Half-elves are like humans in that they get a +1 or they get a +2 to whichever stat they want, which is a +1 modifier bonus. I don't think half-elves are very good. Half-elves are more of a role-playing choice, and let me tell you why. So half-elves get a +2 to perception checks, which, as we've established multiple times, is fine. They're immune to sleep, which is good if you're fighting enemies that have it, and a +2 saving throw against enchantment spells and effects can be useful for being dominated. They also get a +3 to any skill because they get a free skill focus feat at first level. Here's the problem with half-elf. Human gets a free feat of any kind. The only real bonus that half-elves get is the bonus to perception, which, again, is negligible, in my opinion, just because you don't use perception all that often in this game. Skill focus is okay, but here's the thing. Humans can pick any feat. Half-elves are stuck getting a skill bonus, so they're really good at something, but skill checks aren't as important in combat as anything else. So if you want to pick a half-elf, it's really going to mostly be for role-playing purposes. These racial bonuses are not that useful. So if you're playing for the first time and you want a good race, I strongly recommend not playing a half-elf unless it's just something that you want to do for role-playing. Let's talk about half-orc. Alright, half-orcs, like humans, get a +1 skill point every level. They get a +2 racial bonus on persuasion checks when intimidating. They get free proficiency with great axes and falchions, which is really fun for like clerics. Because if you don't get proficiency with those naturally, you can be a cleric and still use a two-handed weapon, which can be a lot of fun because two-handed weapons do a lot of damage. And they also have access to like the Orc double axe as an interesting option for two-weapon fighters without having to take a exotic weapon proficiency feat. So it saves you a feat in that regard, for example. They also have what's called Orc Ferocity, which is when a half-orc is brought below 0 hit points and not outright killed, he can fight for one more round, and then at the end of that round, he falls unconscious. This is more useful than it may initially seem. Think of it as like a last stand, but the thing that you can do with this is that you can stay alive for one more round, and you can use it to drink a healing potion, which keeps you in the fight for longer. But the downside of it is that you can get into a risky situation where you're knocked down to -11 like hit points or something, and then somebody taps you for 5, and you're outright dead. So it's a plus and a minus, and so I consider it to kind of be a neutral but interesting aspect of half-orcs. Half-orcs are definitely better than half-elves. And because of ferocity, that's an ability that's pretty much useful as any class, especially frontline classes, because you get to fight for a little bit longer, which is useful. And again, the weapon familiarity allows for a couple of interesting options. Like half-orc ranger, for example, can go down the two-weapon fighting path and use an orc double axe as their choice, which is just really fun. I like half-orcs. They're alright. Not as good as humans in that regard, but still pretty decent. Let's talk about the Azemar. Alright. So, Azemar are not wholly human. They have a celestial heritage. This doesn't actually do anything initially. At 10th level, you can unlock wings, which give you a movement speed bonus, I believe, as a feat. Azemar get a +2 circumstance bonus on saving against being blinded or dazzled. Situational, but useful. And they also have a resistance to acid, cold, and electricity of 5. This is fine. One of the big downsides with Azemar, though, is that they don't get a bonus to any of their stats. Azemar is kind of the classic paladin type of character because they have a divine heritage, but they don't actually get any bonuses in this game, as far as I'm aware. We can double check that real quick here, but I'm pretty sure. Okay, so actually I'm wrong about the heritage. You get a number of different things that you can choose from, which gives you a +2 to different stats. So actually Azemar are good at everything. I take back what I said. Azemar are good at everything depending on what kind you want to pick, and so that actually kind of makes them like a little bit OP. Very good paladin. The classic one I think is strength and charisma, so like an angel kid. Makes you kind of that crusader paladin. Very, very good for that purpose. Very, very good at being clerics as well, just due to the different heritages that they have. And so yeah, I actually take back what I said. I didn't know what the heritages did until I checked it. So actually Azemar are pretty good. And they can do any class because they get bonuses to pretty much everything. So that's really cool. Definitely on par with human in that regard. But anyway, like I said at the start of this video, I'm going to go over very quickly an example build for each type of character. And I'm gonna just go ahead and show that. So let's start with a fighter. So how would I build a fighter? I would recommend playing a dwarf. I'm gonna go ahead and pop into fighter. I would recommend a two-handed fighter, actually, I think. Hold on a second. Okay, so there are pretty much two ways that I would recommend building a dwarven fighter to begin with. We're going to go with a regular fighter. You might also consider a two-handed fighter for this build if you want to be more offensive. But the regular fighter is fine, just because it's very simple and easy to understand. And so first off, we're going to go ahead and pick fighter. Here's how we're going to build our stats. So there was a clear button. Let's see, dump our intelligence. And so we want to start with an 18 strength. Because we're a dwarf, we want to get up to a, let's see, this actually causes a few problems. Something like that will work. So again, we don't care about charisma, as I've talked about earlier in this video, because charisma doesn't really matter at all to us. It affects our persuasion check, but who really cares about persuasion? But we've got a really solid character here who's really, really good at what he does, which is physical fighting. If we wanted to change this build at all, we might do something like this, where we have a little bit more wisdom. This would lower our armor class and reflex saves, but it gives us a bonus to our wisdom and therefore our will saves. So really, this is going to be up to you. Personally, I would advise that you have a higher dexterity score, and the reason for this is that this is going to give you more armor class, which is going to make you more durable regardless of what kind of build that you do. But the build specifically we're going to start with is a power attacking two-handed greatsword character, and our only ability type that we're going to have is going to be athletics, because we only get one skill point, but that doesn't really matter because fighters aren't supposed to be skilled. They can be if you're a human, if you have an okay intelligence, if you decide to like not dump intelligence like I have here. But we're a dwarf, so the amount of points that we'd have to invest to actually get a decent check, right, is a lot, and we don't want to do that. So we have a regular feat and a combat feat, and with fighters, the thing you have to understand is you really, really, really want to avoid wasting your regular feats on things that like it can be risky taking regular feats with fighters, taking combat feats with fighters instead of regular feats. What do I mean by regular feats? Things like save feats, for example, can be a problem for fighters. But let me just go ahead and show you what I would recommend for this build in particular. So let's see, where is, let's just hide unavailable, because I already know the feats I want to take. So for some reason it doesn't recommend power attack, which is kind of funny. So first thing that we're going to do is we're going to take weapon focus. Weapon focus is a seemingly not very good feat because it gives you a +1 to attack with a specific weapon. So what we're going to do is we're going to make a versatile two-handed fighter that can also, if he wants to, use a one-handed weapon. So because dwarves can use the Dwarven War Axe, we're going to take weapon-focused Dwarven War Axe. This is going to give us a +1 to attack rolls when using a Dwarven War Axe, which is important because attacking, if you have a low attack bonus, you can't hit anything. So we really need to be able to do that. So for our bonus combat feat, though, we're going to take a very important feat, one I mentioned earlier in the video. We're going to take Power Attack. This will allow us to trade attack bonus for damage, attack bonus that we just got from weapon focus. So kind of see where it's going with that. And how you would go later on with this build is you would just try to buff some basic saves and defenses, grab the Toughness feat, grab Great Fortitude, probably Lightning Reflexes or Iron Will later on at some point. Improved Initiative, again, always a useful one. And this is going to be a medium armor, later heavy armor. Once the fighter gets up to armor training level 2 at 7th level, he can actually wear a full plate with this build and get just a massive amount of armor even when he's not using a heavy shield. So this is just going to be a really, really solid fighter build that's going to be able to do a lot of damage, take a lot of damage, and do whatever your party needs. If we took Toughness at first level instead of one of these other feats, we could start with 17 hit points. But as I've said before, having HP isn't as important as being able to do damage a lot of the time for characters. You need HP, but doing damage is more important. So as you can see, our starting character here has a +5 to hit. This is because fighters get a +1 to their base attack bonus every level, because they're good at fighting. And this is true for all fighting-based classes, so barbarians, rangers, paladins, monks all get this attack progression. They all get +1 attack every level. So as you can see, he has a very high combat maneuver defense. He's very hard to trip. He has a decent +5 bonus, and this bonus goes up for like tripping, disarming, bull rushing, whatever, when his weapon focus adds in. So right now he would be at a +6 to hit. This is the first level, by the way. He has a +6 to hit. If he's two-handing his War Axe, he's doing 1d10 +6 damage, which is going to be anywhere from 7 to 16 damage. That's a lot of damage for a first level character once he gets his Dwarven War Axe. And don't worry, even if you take weapon focus with a weapon that isn't available early on, you generally will find pretty much every weapon that you need to know. And I believe if you're a fighter and you take weapon focus at first level, you actually get the weapon you weapon focused with to start with. That was my experience playing a dwarf anyway, dwarven fighter. So this is a solid dwarven fighter who's going to be able to take damage, deal a lot of damage in return. Is a really, really good buff target. So getting more AC or damage or health from spells he's perfect for this. And his companions make up the slack. He's not a very talkative character, sure, but he is really, really good at fighting, and that's what you need him to do. So this is our dwarf fighter. So let's go back and let's make a rogue, right? So we're going to go a completely different route here. We're going to make a Halfling Rogue, and the reason that we're going to make a Halfling, we have to redo everything here because this interface is a little strangely designed. Now, what I would actually recommend for a lot of people who want to be like the standard archetypal like backstabbing rogue, pick Knife Master. Knife Master is a very solid archetype, but we're just going to do a regular rogue because it's kind of the standard experience, right? So then we have to redistribute our entire stats. Give me just a second. So there are two ways that you can build this if you want to. We are missing out on the charisma bonus that halflings get, but it doesn't matter because our dexterity is 20 starting out. This gives us a +5 to our attack bonus with light weapons. It gives us +5 to our armor class. So we're actually going to be very hard to hit with touch spells. We have a great reflex save. Our intelligence is 14, which is going to give us 5 skill points to start with, because rogues start with 3 in this game. I think I said 4 earlier, so I was wrong about that. Oh, no, wait, no, it is 4. I just had one assigned already. So this gives us a decent selection of skills to work with still, even though we're a halfling. Our charisma is still only a 9, even though we dumped it, which is pretty hilarious, all things considered, because that means we can still, if we want to, take Persuasion, use Magic Device, and while we won't be as good at it as other characters, we're still decent enough at it that we don't completely suck. So again, going back to dumping stats, it's not min-maxing, it's optimizing, and there's a very big difference there. So anyway, this is a decent spread of stats. We've got ourselves a nice dexterity. We've got a decent constitution, so that our hit points starting out are 11, which is a lot better than if you just dumped con and only had like 9 at first level. And again, every level you're going to get 2 additional hit points from that score, so it's very useful. But this isn't the only way we can build this, of course. There are other ways to do it. But I think this is the most well-rounded way. If you wanted to make a more perceptive, wise kind of rogue, right? Things like that. You might go with wisdom, and this would give you a better will save than a fortitude save. And this can be actually pretty useful for ranged rogues who are just trying to be the sniper, basically, who sit in the back and shoot at flanked enemies and get sneak attacks. So having a higher wisdom there can be a smart idea, but in general, I actually recommend the Constitution more, just because it's more hit points. For abilities, the number one thing a rogue does better than anyone else, a standard rogue, is what's called trickery in this game, which lets you disable traps and stuff like that. Rogues get a bonus to do this, so you really, really, really want to have this. Now, Halflings get a bonus to stealth, so this character is going to be really, really good at sneaking around and spotting things, taking out traps before the party actually engages. So if you play this rogue intelligently, you're going to get a lot of mileage out of this. And even though your dice roll is going to be lower than if you weren't a rogue, your hit chance is going to be very high, and you're going to be able to do a lot of sneak attack damage, whether you decide to use a melee or a ranged weapon. It doesn't really matter for this character. And I'll just go ahead and round out our build here, and we'll just do mostly physical stats. We'll avoid the charisma stuff. That's not really our character style. He's very cloak and dagger, no magic kind of person. So what feat do I actually recommend you take to start with? So rogues get weapon finesse by default in this game, which is good because they really, really want to have that. And at 3rd level, they add their dexterity bonus to damage. So one thing that you can do for the rogue is, if you want to be a melee fighter, take Piranha Strike at 1st level, or take Toughness to give yourself more hit points, because rogues are a little bit squishy even though they have good AC from their dexterity. If you want to be an archer, I recommend taking Point Blank Shot at 1st level, and then at your next feat immediately pick up Precise Shot. But for this character, we're going to pick up Piranha Strike because we really, really, really want to be good at the whole backstabbing thing, and this is going to give us a lot of damage to work with. Another option that you can do is, if you want to, 2-weapon fighting is a thing that only characters with really high dexterity can do. I actually recommend taking this later because attack bonuses are really low early on, but if you want to, having a weapon in each hand, you can do multiple attacks per round, and each attack can get that sneak attack. So this is really, really good for the rogue. But either way, I'm going to go with Piranha Strike. I like the idea of just doing one fatal strike with a dagger and just being done with it. I like the guaranteed damage. I like that. So let's see. I think it's skipped over our overview here. Okay, and so this is our rogue. He's only got a +0 to hit, but that's because we don't have a light weapon yet that we can actually use. If we actually factored in everything, he would be at a +5 from his dexterity, and then he would have a +1 from his size, so he would actually have a +6 to hit with a dagger or a short sword or a rapier, for example. It would only do a d4 damage because he's small, but he gets a sneak attack, which is where most of his damage comes from. And this is a build that you can do right out the gate and have a nice backstabby rogue that can tumble around the battlefield and not take attacks of opportunity, who can sneak around, who can disable traps and spot those traps as well, and who's going to have decent saves and have enough hit points that you don't just die immediately. So let's take a look at our Cleric. Alright, so for our Cleric, ideally we'd want to be a dwarf, but let's go ahead and make a human. Just because we haven't made a human yet. And I'll go ahead and do the stats here real quick. Alright, so let's back it up here a second. So, first of all, as far as the actual Cleric that you want to do, just playing a standard Cleric is going to be... it's going to work out for a lot of you. If you want to be a heavy armored Cleric, play the Crusader. If you want to be a summoner, you can be a Herald Caller, and if you want to do more like God-focused things than you already are, you can be an Ecclesiarch. I recommend just the base Cleric is the way to go, I think, but Crusader can be really good as well if you want more of that heavy armor experience, and you don't really sacrifice much for any of these archetypes, so they're all quite good and fun to pick from. Cleric in general is one of the better classes in the game, not just for defensive purposes. What I'm going to recommend for starting people is that you go with either Sarenrae or Iomedae. These are both good deities, which means that you're going to do healing channels of energy for your party instead of negative ones, or don't have to choose. Sarenrae lets you wield a scimitar, and Iomadai lets you wield a longsword, both of which are weapons that you wouldn't be able to normally wield otherwise. I'm going to go with Sarenrae because she's kind of the classic one. An interesting one. It appears that the deity selection locks after you select it, so we're just going to go ahead and stick with Sarenrae. We'll channel positive because we don't have a choice, and then for our options here, we're going to go with Healing Domain because we can do more healing, and that's the kind of thing that we really want to do. And then as the other one, I recommend that you do Sun Domain. Sun Domain lets you kill undead really well. But I believe that Glory Domain is actually really strong as well. Both of these let you absolutely demolish undead, which is really, really useful. There's a lot of undead in Pathfinder, so these are both pretty good, I would say. We're going to go ahead and go with Sun Domain just because it's classic. It's a lot easier to do. And of course we want Healing Domain for the extra bonuses it confers and the amount of extra healing that we can do, which is going to help us keep our party alive if we decide to play a Cleric. Now I'm going to go ahead and do the ability scores. Alright, so these are stats I would consider well optimized for a human Cleric. We could try to get 18 Wisdom, but the problem is we're already so strapped for ability scores anyway. If you don't care as much about turning undead or the amount of times that you can channel, you can actually dump charisma a little bit more and get your wisdom a lot higher and maybe put your stats elsewhere. Admittedly, I don't like this quite as much because again, the way the point building system works is it's a little bit awkward sometimes trying to fit these stats in here somewhere. So you can do something like this, or you can do it the other way that I was showing just before. For skills, Lore Religion you'll want to have just because it's there. But actually Persuasion's not a bad one for our Cleric. We want our Cleric to be persuasive because he's not very intelligent, and that's fine. He's a religious type. Oh boy, I just angered like half the internet. Anyway, what do we want to pick for our first feat here? Well, to be honest with you, see, we don't want to show unavailable ones. So let's get rid of those. So extra channeling is a good one. Will let us channel healing energy 2 more times a day. Heavy armor proficiency is useful because armor shouldn't interfere with spellcasting. I've heard reports that it does currently affect Cleric spellcasting, but that'll be patched out probably soon, so nothing to worry about there. Spell focus with certain kinds of spells are also pretty good. Selective channel, though, I would say is definitely one that we want, because this way we can choose not to heal other people, and so we can heal during combat, which is very, very useful. And the other feat that we're going to go with, and this is debatable whether or not you want to do this, but this is going to be a type of Cleric that more people are familiar with, the sort of like Master of Healing type of Cleric. You'll also want to take extra channel to go along with the selective channeling, because that way you can choose who to pick when you're channeling your healing energy with your channel energy ability, and you get to do it 2 additional times per day, which with our character, if we just go ahead and go to the total, is going to go ahead and be, I believe, so with extra turning we can do this 7 times a day instead of 5. That's a lot of healing. We can really do a good job of keeping our party alive with this character. And he's not particularly frail either. +2 constitution, he can handle himself in melee, and he's still got a decent wisdom. And at 4th level, if you want, you can bump his charisma up to do more healing, although I would just recommend putting another point into his wisdom. So anyway, that's the Cleric, and let's move on to our last character, the Wizard. Okay, so let's talk about the Wizard. We're going to go ahead and play an Elven Wizard. Elves get a +2 to their Dexterity and Intelligence, which is going to make them a lot better at being wizards. They're going to have more armor, better at dodging reflex saves and stuff like that. The -2 to Constitution does kind of suck, but we have an option that helps us kind of get around that. So for our Arcane Bond, we've chosen the Chicken Familiar. We're going to have a little magical chicken running around with us. That's going to give us +3 to hit points and +2 to perception checks. Another really good one is the Hare Familiar, which gives you a very, very nice +4 to your initiative check. You can also take the Hunter's Bond ability, which is weird. I don't know why that's on here. I think that, actually, the reason that it looks weird is because this is supposed to give you an animal companion, as if you were a druid or a ranger. But this is nice too, because then you can have an actual companion to add to like the field to help you like, you know, fight, which is really nice. So there's a lot of different options here. Chicken familiar, hare familiar are both pretty good. Arcane object with a bond, or arcane bond with an object, really, really good. And hunter's bond is also really, really good. Those are what I recommend for these. We're gonna go with the chicken for simplicity's sake, and because it's kind of funny. For our stats, we've got 20 intelligence. This is going to make our spells really, really awesome. And more importantly, at first level, +5 to our intelligence is going to give us +2 first level spells that we can cast per day, which is just really, 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 really nice. Really good. I didn't have a stroke, I promise. But we've got 16 dexterity, which is good. 12 con is not so great, but it is what it is. We start out with 11 hit points still, which is pretty nice, considering we have a 6-sided die. But that's because of our chicken. Our chicken is giving us a lot of health. We'd have 8 otherwise. Our AC is okay. We can boost that with a spell like Mage Armor, which is fine. We'll go ahead and just take all of our class skills, because why not? And then we'll go ahead, we're actually going to take a stealth and make our character better at hiding, just because that's something that we really, really want to do. As for the actual feats, well, there's a lot to choose from. Alright, so I've identified a bug. When we went from human to elf, we actually accidentally still had the extra feat from human, so I went back and I fixed it by reloading the entire thing. Our ability scores are still the same, but here are the feats I've chosen to go with, and you can swap these out for a couple of things, but we went ahead and got Spell Focus Enchantment and Greater Spell Focus Enchantment. So this is a +2 to saves for our enchantment spells, making them really hard to resist. And we've chosen to focus on enchantment because we want to be the domineering type of wizard. This is not the only way to play. Summoner wizards that focus on conjuration are really good, and even evocation-focused wizards are also really good. For those two cases, getting spell focus, and then just greater spell focus for evocation, and the augment summoning feat for conjuration are both really, really good things to have. We've chosen necromancy and illusion as our two opposing schools. Necromancy doesn't have a lot of useful spells in it unless you focus in it, so I always find it's a really easy one to toss aside because it doesn't have a lot of spells where it's like, I need that. For example, transmutation has the spell haste, and that's a spell that you're like, I need that. Haste is a really, really good spell. You don't want to give it up for nothing. Or at the very least, make it cost double the amount of spell slots, which is what opposition schools do for wizards. For our other opposition school, we've chosen Illusion. This is because we're already going to be affecting people in the mind with our enchantment spells. We don't need Illusion as well. Divination is a really easy pick just because there aren't a lot of good divination spells. They can be handy. I don't find them to be like particularly amazing. But anyway, that's our really, really simple feat selection here. You could also go with Toughness and Combat Casting if you're worried you're going to be getting attacked a lot and you want to be able to cast emergency spells, for example. But anyway, now we have to pick our spells. Alright, so here's our first level spells, and here's why we chose them. We get a lot of first level spells because our intelligence is high. The higher your intelligence, the more spells you start out with. But anyway, so we've chosen Sleep and Hypnotism. These are the only two enchantment spells at first level, but these are going to be extremely hard to resist. Sleep makes enemies helpless, and in the early game that's invaluable. You can really cut down on a lot of combats with this spell. So if you're playing a wizard and you want to do this build, you definitely want to have this spell. This is really good. Hypnotism is also pretty useful because, again, it's not like the actual pen and paper game. You can actually use this in combat to daze a lot of enemies. And again, because we chose Greater Spell Focus, our save for the spell, these two spells are going to be ridiculously good for enemies to have to resist. So they're going to have a hard time overcoming these. We've chosen Mage Armor as a spell. This is basically your armor. It lasts for an hour per level of wizard that you have, so it lasts quite a while because it's an actual hour in game, and that's a lot of time. You're going to clear most dungeons in that time. But so that bonus to armor class is just going to be your mainstay. If you're getting attacked at all, or you expect that you will be, you want to cast this ahead of time because it lasts so long. Next is Magic Missile. This is just a staple for most wizards. It's just automatic damage, no rolls required. Very useful in that regard. Enlarge Person, really good spell to cast. Remember when I was talking about the Dwarven Fighter being a character that is good to cast buffs on. This is a spell that's great to cast on fighters because it increases their strength, so it increases their damage, and it also increases the damage die that they're using. So a D10 becomes a D12 in terms of damage, for example. 2D6 becomes 2D8, etc. So this is a really, really good spell to cast early on, and it's a spell that can actually last later on. And it's just really, really nice to buff. You could alternatively take a Reduce Person, which is more of a debuff that you can cast on enemies, but they have a chance to resist that if they want to. Summon Monster 1 we've taken because it summons a dog, and summoned creatures are great because they're just free hit points and damage. If an enemy attacks a summoned monster, it's done its job. So this is actually why Summoners are one of the strongest classes in the game that you can pick. And you'll want to go with Summoner for that exact reason if you do that. But having this even as a non-conjuration specialist is still pretty useful. It's something that you can do to actively help any fight without actively having to do damage yourself. Next is Expeditious Retreat. This increases your base movement speed by 30 feet. And it's quick to cast, too, if I'm not mistaken. This is really useful because if you're about to be attacked by someone and you know you are, you can cast this on yourself and run the heck away. So it's just a really nice emergency, like, oh shit spell that you can have on your person. Last but not least, we have Burning Hands. If you want to be able to do damage, this gives you the option to do a little bit of splash damage. There is a fight early on where having the spell as a wizard will be crucial. I don't want to spoil anything, but having the spell makes your life a lot easier in the early game for one particular fight that a lot of people have trouble with. So having it as a wizard is also a good idea. And anyway, if we go ahead and look at our total here, the other thing to consider about the reason we picked Elf is because we can use a longbow from the back, and we have a decent dexterity of 16, so we can actually make pretty good use of it. We'll have a +3 to hit, which early on is okay. +3 is not bad early on. Our attack won't scale well into the late game, but there will be spells and things that we can use on ourselves to actually do physical damage if we want to, if our allies are already improved, for example. But that's getting kind of into the minutiae of the character. This will be a build that will allow you to control the battlefield with a wizard. There is obviously like a blaster build that you could try to do instead. But this is a wizard I definitely recommend to start with. It's going to get a lot of work done. You're going to get a lot of results out of this character. But anyway, in conclusion, what I want to say about character building in Pathfinder. It's okay to build good characters. This is not like building a character like this, right? Some people see this as min-maxing, and those people are going to feel that way no matter what. But if you're new to the game and you want to succeed, and you don't feel guilty about building characters this way, because whether or not you think of it, your character's first of all supposed to be a hero. Second of all, it's okay to have flaws in your character. Like I said, having a low charisma, having a low intelligence in a class that doesn't need it, those aren't so debilitating like they are in a lot of games, to where you have to worry about them breaking your character if you don't build a well-balanced statistic character. What you really, really want to do is just have a character that's good at what they're supposed to do. I think that's the best solid advice that I can give to anyone. If your character needs dexterity, right? So Rangers need dexterity to hit, and you build a ranger that doesn't have a high dexterity, like an 18 or a 20, you're going to suffer because your character's not going to be that good, and you'll get mad, you'll get frustrated, you'll be like, this game is too hard, you'll set it down to story mode, and you'll be mad at yourself because you feel like this game is too hard, when in reality you've made a mistake from day one without realizing that you have made a mistake and not being willing to admit that you did. In response to some of the criticism about this game, there are some difficult sections, and the developers are currently working on a way to make it more balanced. But for the time being, we just kind of have to deal with it. And so you should look to build characters like this to make the game more enjoyable and still have it be a challenge, I think. And yeah, that's the best advice that I can give you, is just build characters that make sense. Don't do wacky things. Always ask yourself when you take a feat, is this actively going to help me in most situations? If the answer is no, then you should seriously reconsider what you're trying to do. When you're building your ability points, you need to ask yourself if the stats that you're putting are things that you actually need. And again, I don't consider this min-maxing, I consider this optimizing. Optimizing is making sure that your character is good at what they're supposed to do. Min-maxing is breaking the game. This is not min-maxing. This is making a character that's actually good at what they're trying to do. And you can vary it up a little bit. You don't have to put like a 20 in something to be like considered good or anything like that. You can easily take this 20 down to an 18 on this wizard and add it to wisdom and have a little bit better of a willpower wizard, or improve his constitution because he's an elf. There's a lot of different ways to build characters in this game, and it's one of the most enjoyable things about Pathfinder in general, both in pen and paper and in this game. So I hope that this video was helpful, even though I meant for it to be a lot shorter. And if you enjoyed it, be sure to give it a like and comment, subscribe, blah, 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 blah. I have a Patreon, which I'll link in the description. If you want to see more videos of this type, consider donating, or just leave a comment saying that I did a good job and you enjoyed it. Honestly, the comment means a lot more to me than the money. And anyway, if you enjoyed this, I plan on making more Pathfinder videos in the future, so stay tuned. I might even do a Let's Play. I'll catch you next time.